So we get up to Daf Beis Omid Beis, and you may recall that there was a situation in which Rav Papa missed the shear of Rava, and Ravina pointed out to Rav Papa that he missed a very important class because Rava had presented what seems to be a contradiction between two principles that we have as far as Lishma and Shalol Lishma. And then, as Ravina told Rav Papa, Rava reconciled this contradiction. And this was something which, in the language of Ravina, Rav Papa missed something called Mili Ma'al Yisa, something very special. I guess you translate it as great halachas. So the Gemara now is going to ask my Mili Ma'al Yisa. So let's see where we got up to inside. We're on Daf Beis Amid Beis. And we count down from the top of the Amud 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 lines down, and the last 3 words in line number 5 are my mili ma'ali. So what were these great things that Rava asked the kasha and he gave a teretz? And here we get into the kasha of Rava. Tznan. Our Mishnah says, as it opens Maseches Zevachim, Kol hazvachim shenizbechu shelo lishman ksherim el shelo olu lebaylim lidei chova. That if you have a zevach and there was lacking a lishma, that's the absence of a positive lishma, then the carbon is kosher. It's not olu lebaylim l'shem chova, and they'll have to replace the carbon with another carbon, but the carbon itself is kosher. Taima, the reason why this carbon is problematic is because of shalol lishman, right? The Mishnah says, hazvachim nizbechu shalol lishman. And the language shalol lishman indicates that there was, again, the language here is a little difficult, but I'll try. There was a positive, negative kavanah. In other words, in a positive sense, the Kohen had shalol lishma. He brought a carbon ola l'shem shlomim. So he had a kavana l'shem shlomim. That's called a kavana shalol l'shma. And that's why the Mishnah says that this carbon is not ola l'shem bailim, l'shem chova, because of the negative kavana that he had shalol l'shma. Comes along Rava with the following diuk. If you understand the Mishnah meticulously, hastama, the implication of the Mishnah is that if the Kohen had nothing in mind, if you recall, I called it the jughead, that he had no kavanah, not l'shem ola, which he should have had, and not l'shem shlomim, it was just that middle of the road, kind of a neutral, empty kavanah, then olu nami lebailim shem chova. The implication knew it to be a perfectly good carbon, and the bailim who took upon themselves harei olai lahavi ola, which is called a neder, would have fulfilled their mitzvah because the carbon is a carbon ola. And what makes the carbon ola? Alma stami lama kidishmaloi. Stama means that since they consecrated this behemoth, this animal, for the purpose of a carbon ola, then it automatically is ola as a carbon ola. You don't need a positive kavana l'shem ola. All you need is that there shouldn't be a negative kavana l'shem shlomim or other zevach. The absence of a negative kavana, which is called in the Lashon Hashas stama, is sufficient, and the carbon is kosher. Viraminhi. And here's where Rava, when he gave the shir, which unfortunately Rav Papa was not there that time, quotes a Mishnah in Gittin on Daf Chav Daled as a contradiction to prove that stama shalol lishma, meaning it's not enough that you had a kavana stama, that doesn't make it lishma. You need a kavana in a positive way lishma. Whereas in Zevach, we prove from our Mishnah that you don't need a positive kavana, you just need the absence of a negative kavana. And the Mishnah there in Gittin says, Kol haget shenichtav shelo l'shem isha pasul. And even though the language of the Mishnah is that it was written Shalol L'Shem Isha, and the Gemara is going to give us a few different possible scenarios where it was written Shalol L'Shem Isha. Nevertheless, the halacha is that even if it was written Stama, and the Sofer, when he wrote the get, he did not have in mind this husband and this wife, is possible, the get would be possible. And we'll see later on how Rava derived that conclusion. Stama nami pasul. So how could it be that in Gittin stama is pasul, whereas in Zevach and Karbanos stama is kosher? Vishani, and Rava reconciled this contradiction, and he claims and establishes that there are two different principles that operate in two different contexts of the halacha. They shouldn't be compared. Zevachim, with regard to Karbanos, is bistama lishman omdim, since he designated this animal as a karban olah, then it is waiting to be brought and crying out to be brought as an olah. I am an olah. I don't need the Kohen to think that this is an olah. But Isha, stoma lav legerishin koi, omedes. She's not omedes. She's not standing there waiting for a get. We don't anticipate a get. And therefore, you need a kavana in the positive sense, l'shem ha'isha, l'shem ha'ish, l'shem ha'isha, in order to be maksha the get. But stama is possible. So the Gemara now raises the following question: Uzvachim b'stama ksheira minolan. I'm very curious, says the Gemara. How did Rava derive the conclusion that in Zevachim, even if the Kohen did not have a positive kavana, he just had a stomach kavana, that's sufficient, and the korban is kosher and it's ola l'shem bailim? Disnan, the answer is because he learned it as a diuk from our Mishnah. Kol hazvachim shenizbchu shalol l'shman. When is it not ola l'shem chova l'shem bailim? That's only because he had kavana shalol l'shman. Shalol l'shman means that he had kavana for a shlomim when it was a korban olah. V'lo kitani, it should have said kol hazvachim shelo nizbechu l'shman einam olah l'bein bailim. That you need a kavana in a positive sense l'shem karban olah. It doesn't say that. It just says that if he had a kavana for another zevach, for a shlomim, for example, then it's not olah l'bailim l'shem chova. So the Gemara objects, wait a minute. If that's the way you're learning a Mishnah, let's apply the same methodology and the same diuk to the Mishnah in Gittin. Gabi get nami haktani, kol get shenichtav, shalol l'shem isha pasul. If the get wasn't written in a positive sense for the sake of this woman, it's pasul. Lo ketani shalo nichtav l'shem isha pasul. The Mishnah doesn't say that it was pasul even in a case of stama. The Mishnah says it was pasul because he had a positive kavanah for another woman, right? That's called shalol l'shma. The Mishnah, according to you, Rava, to be very consistent, should have said that if there was an absence of a kavanah l'shem isha, it's pasul. Because you're telling me, Rava, that in the case of an isha, lav l'shem gerish and omedis, and therefore you need a positive kavana l'shem ha'isha. It should have said in the Mishnah that any get that was not written l'shem ha'isha is possible. Why did the Mishnah say no? It was written shalol l'shem ha'isha, as if to say it was written for another woman. Ella mehadis not. It must be that Rava, when he derived the conclusion that in Zevachim, stama is kosher, and it's olah l'bailim l'shem chova, he had in mind a different Mishnah, not our Mishnah, but rather the Mishnah later on at Daf Yud Gimel, Keitzad l'shman v'shalol l'shman. Okay, let's give a little bit of background to this Mishnah. We're talking about a korban Pesach. Now, in the case of a korban Pesach, we need kavana l'shem Pesach. Now, let's say you have what's called tchilas shchita and sof shchita. So the shchita process, because it has a continuum, can be divided into two kavanos. He could have one kavana at the beginning of a shchita. He could have a different kavana at the end of the shchita. So the first case in the Mishnah in Zevachim Daf Yud Gimel is a case where he initially started his shechita l'shem Pesach, and then he had a different mindset, a different kavana when he got to the sof shechita, the second part of the shechita, and he had in mind l'shem shlomim. Now, in such a case, since there's a tarovis of not only lishma, l'shem Pesach, at the beginning of the shechita, but also l'shem zevach acher, l'shem shlomim at the end of the shechita, so that a kavana shalo lotes is a kavana shalo lishma, and that's what's going to passel the carbon, and it cannot be a viable carbon Pesach. So Rav is medayik. Taima diyamar l'shem Pesach l'shem shlomim. The problem here with this carbon, and the reason why it's possible as a carbon Pesach, is because he had an additional kavana, a positive kavana l'shem shlomim, hol l'shem Pesach, ustama. If, let's say, he started his shechita l'shem Pesach, and when he got to the sof shechita, he had in mind nothing whatsoever, his mind was a jughead, is kosher. Alma stama and kilishmadami. That we consider it as if that second half of the shechita, which requires lishma, was considered lishma. Why? Because stama is kilishma. Gemara says, what are you talking about? That's not a fair analogy. Dilma shani hasam the amrinan kol osel das rishona hu osa. He started with a kavana lishma l'shem Pesach, and therefore the maisa flows on that kavana. And even in the absence of a thought process, a positive thought process of l'shem Pesach, it is l'shem Pesach because we go basa tchila samachshava. By the way, there are similar halachas in shechita, in chulin, that everything depends upon his first kavana. There are similar halachas in tefillah, where if you started your tefillah l'shem mitzvahs tefillah, you don't need kavana at the end of the tefillah, possibly in Kriyat Shema. There are many cases where the halacha and the principle that underlies the halacha is kala osel das rishono osa. Ella, says the Gemara, Rava's proof that stama in Zevachim is kilishma dami is from the Sefer. What does it say in the Sefer? In the Sefer, he reversed the order. He started with a kavana l'shem shlomim, and then he finished the shechita l'shem Pesach. Shalo lishman ulishma. Do you see how the sequence changes? Before it was lishman and shalo lishma. Now it's shalo lishma lishma. L'shem shlom l'shem Pesach. And the Mishnah says that the carbon is possible. Time of the reason, says Rava, that the carbon is possible, it's not a carbon Pesach, is the Amar l'shem shlom l'shem Pesach, because he had a positive kavana l'shem shlomim, a kavanas shalo l'shma b'tchilas hashchita. The implication is stama. If, let's say, he had nothing in mind at the beginning of the shechita, and then he had in mind at the end of the shechita l'shem Pesach, it would be kosher. It would be a valid carbon Pesach, and he fulfills his obligation. So you see that even though at the tchilas hashchita he had nothing in mind, it was stama, nevertheless it's kosher. It's only possible because in this case, in the Sefer of the Mishnah, he had in mind at the beginning of the shechita l'shem shlomim. So we see clearly now, says Rava, that stama and kilishma. Again, the Gemara rejects it. Dilma shiny hasam diamrinan hochiach sofal tchilaso. It's very interesting. The Gemara is sort of posef al shtei asifim. It's accepting both principles. On the one hand, the Gemara is operating with the principle das rishona hu oseh. On the other hand, the Gemara is operating with the yochiach sofo al tchilaso, which means that the end kavana, we call it in Hilchas Shabbos the Makabe Patish kavana, is kovea even the tchilas kavana. Even at the beginning of the shechita, he had in mind l'shem Pesach, if it was stama. But it's not based on stama kalishma, but rather it's based on the principle of yochiach sofa al tchilaso. Inami, another way of learning it is either the tani lishman v'shalo lishman. Right in the Reisha, we spoke about a case of lishman and then shalo lishman. Tani nami, he also says in the Sefer to have a symmetry in parallel. He says shalo lishman ulishman. But the truth is that even though the Mishnah at the end of the Sefer says L'Shem Shlom L'Shem Pesach, the truth is that it could be that he does need a positive kavanah, but yet Yochiach Sofal Tchilas. Elamiha, now we have to take another attempt based on a Mishnah later on at Daf Mem Vav. L'Shem Shishud Var Mazevach Nizbach. The Kohen should have in mind 6 different kavanos when he shechs the korban. Number 1, L'Shem Zevach, right? L'Shem Zevach means that if it was consecrated for the purpose of an Olah, he has in mind L'Shem Olah. L'Shem Zoveach, if it was consecrated by Ruvain, he has to have in mind when he shechs it L'Shem Ruvain. L'Shem Hashem, right? L'Shmo Shal HaKadosh Baruch Hu. L'Shem Ishim, for the kavanah to take the emurim and be maktir the emurim al gabi mizbeach. L'shem reach. Okay, here we have issues about what's l'shem reach, and then number 6 is l'shem nichoach. What's the difference between reach and nichoach? But in any event, there should be a reach at the time of the Torah. That reach is the cloud of smoke that goes up towards Shemayim, and it's got to be l'shem nichoach, that it should be a nachas ruach ta'kodesh baruch. V'achatas v'osham, we can add number 7 here. The 7th kavanah, says the Mishnah, is that in the case of chatas v'osham, you have to have l'shem chet, that you're bringing this korban and you're doing the avodah for the purpose of chet, meaning kapara for chet. And that's true both in the cases of chatos and osha. So that is the Tanakama of the Mishnah later on Daf Mem Vav. Then the Mishnah has a dialogue back and forth between a dissenting view of Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim who protect and defend their view. Om Rabbi Yossi, af al pi, af misha lo hoye belibo l'shem achas mikolelu kosher. Rabbi Yossi made a takana. He was afraid that if we're going to require that the Kohen enunciates all these kavanos, that might not be such a good idea. It might lead to a violation of Chas v'Shalom Hotzah Shem Hashem L'Shah. And we'll explain why in a minute. But anyway, Rabbi Yossi made a takana that afal pi shelo haisa beliba l'shem achas b'kolei l'kosher lefi shetnai bezdin. Bezdin made a takana that a person, a Kohen, who's doing the avodah, for example, the shechita, he should have in mind stam. He should not mention all these things. Why? Because asnu bezdin d'olema l'shmo dilma asi l'meimar shalo l'shmo. We're afraid that if we require the Kohen to make a statement that I am shechting this animal l'shmo, and he mentions the name of God, then you know what might happen? He might actually have a shalo l'shmo. So we don't want to get involved in that. And therefore, he should just shech the korban stam. Because again, if he's going to say lishmo, then maybe he'll come to have in mind a different this and a different that, maybe a different korban. So the Gemara says the following: if isal kedaitach stam apostle, if you're not going to accept Rava's principle that stam and kilishman and it's kosher and zvachim is kaime beis dinu masni vilsa de mifsalabu. Bezdin is going to say, you know what? Have kavanah stam. The korban is possible. How could there be a chutzpah on the part of a Bezdin to make such a takana like Rabbi Yossi had in mind that he shouldn't have kavanah l'shem Hashem, l'shem Zevach, etc., etc.? Then the Rabbanah making takana that will undermine and disqualify all the karbanos. The proof in the pudding is that stomach kilishma, and therefore the takana was just don't say it out, don't speak it out. Have in mind l'shem stam, and let's rely and activate the principle of stam l'shma. So you see that stam l'shma. Now Rava has proven, based on this Mishnah Mem Vav, that in Zevachim stam l'shma. In Get, Rav established that the opposite is true. Stama is kishalolishma. You need a positive kavana l'shem ish l'shem isha. How does he know that? The Gabi Get to Stama Apostle Minolan. How does he know that if in the absence of a positive kavana l'shem ish, it's possible? And now the Gemara is going to give us an entire slew of Mishnayos in Gittin. We're going to get a tamtzit of Masechta Gittin. If it's based on the Mishnah on Daf Chav Daled in Masechta Gittin, that if a get was written not for the purpose of this isha, it's possible. Haya over b'shuk. A man had a wife, and he had in mind to divorce his wife. Vishama Sofrim. And as he was going down the shuk, he heard right next door there was Sofrim, scribes who were writing a get, and they were makri l'talmideim. They read out loud the get so that the talmidim, the stagirs, as we call them in modern Hebrew here in Israel, the apprentices that are learning how to write a get, should hear how he has to declare his kavana when he writes the get. So the sofer yelled out loud for the talmidim, Ish Ploni Giresh is divorcing his wife Plonis Mimakom Plon. This man who walked by and happened to hear this statement that the get was being written for Avram, who's divorcing his wife Sarah, Hareze Shmi V'Shem Ishti. That happens to be the name that I have, I'm Avram, and my wife's name is Sarah. You know what? Let me go into the sofer and say, you were only writing this get for the sake of teaching the Talmidim. I want to use this get to divorce my wife. Also, he cannot use it to be, even if he pays the fees to the scribe, he can't use it. And the reason for that is because it was shalol lishma. And the Mishnah seems to assume that the psul of get here is because the sofer had in mind a different Avram and a different Sarah. That's called a machshava shalol lishma. The Gemara answers, no, there's no proof from that Mishnah. Dilma kid Rav Papa, the Rav Papa hacha besofer masuyim l'slamed askinan, dilo ichtu l'shem krisus klal. True. A get doesn't need a positive l'shem ish or l'shem isha zu. And stomach is kil shma, but he has to have in mind the barest minimum l'shem gerishin. Here, he doesn't have even in mind l'shem gerishin. He has in mind to teach the Talmidim. Hello. And here we're going to turn to Daf Gimel. And as I said yesterday, we want to get a little bit of a head start because Zevachim is not going to be easy. Let's take a look, says the Gemara, to find a source for Rava that Stam is puzzle and get from another Mishnah in Gittin. Yeser al Kain, Kosav. So we're now on Daf Gimel.